Picture this. You're standing in the shadows of a magnificent cathedral in Vienna, the year 1496 AD, and you witness something that makes your blood turn to ice in your veins. A tiny girl, no older than 10, stands at the altar with tears streaming down her pale cheeks, her small body trembling so violently that the oversized wedding gown threatens to slip from her shoulders. Blood seeps through the white silk where the heavy golden crown has cut into her scalp, too large for a child's head but forced onto her anyway. The man beside her is old enough to be her grandfather, his calloused hands gripping her wrists so tightly that finger-shaped bruises already bloom purple against her skin. You are watching little Maria of Austria being sold to her own uncle like cattle at market, and the ring being forced onto her child's finger will mark the beginning of a nightmare that will destroy not just her life, but poison an entire royal bloodline for generations to come. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. What you're about to hear isn't just another tale of medieval politics. It's the story of how dynastic ambition can transform family bonds into chains of suffering, how the pursuit of pure bloodlines can create generations of damaged children, and how a single family's obsession with power would ultimately lead to their own genetic destruction. The name Maria of Austria might not be familiar to you, but her story will haunt you long after you finish listening. Let's start with the family that would become the architects of this centuries-long tragedy. The Habsburgs weren't born into royalty. In fact, their origins trace back to a modest castle in what is now Switzerland, built sometime around 1020 AD. But through a combination of strategic marriages, calculated warfare, and ruthless political maneuvering, they had clawed their way to the very pinnacle of European power. By the late 15th century, they controlled vast territories spanning from Austria to the Netherlands, from Spain to parts of Italy. But power, as the Habsburgs would learn, comes with a price that compounds with each generation. And price would be paid not by the ambitious men who sought the crown, but by the innocent children born into their web of calculated breeding. The Habsburg obsession with bloodline purity began with a simple but devastating premise: that royal blood was fundamentally different from common blood, that mixing noble lineage with that of lesser families would somehow dilute their divine right to rule. This belief, twisted by centuries of reinforcement, would evolve into something far more sinister: the conviction that the purest royal blood came from marriages within the family itself. Maria's fate was sealed long before she could walk or speak. Born in 1485 to Archduke Philip the Handsome and Joanna the Mad, she entered a world where her value was measured not in her potential for happiness or fulfillment, but in her usefulness as a political tool. The marriage contract binding her to her uncle Maximilian had been signed when she was barely 3 years old. Her destiny locked in by men who saw her as nothing more than a means to consolidate territorial claims and strengthen bloodline purity. But let's step back and understand the man who would become her husband. Maximilian wasn't a monster in the traditional sense. By the standards of his time, he was considered a relatively enlightened ruler. He patronized the arts, supported humanist scholars, and was known for his military innovations. But he was also a man completely consumed by the Habsburg vision of dynastic supremacy, willing to sacrifice anything and anyone to maintain the family's grip on power. The age difference between Maria and Maximilian was staggering. He was 37 years old when he married his 10-year-old niece, old enough to be her father, with a lifetime of experience that she couldn't even begin to comprehend. But age wasn't the only barrier between them. Maximilian had already been married twice before, both marriages ending in the deaths of his wives under circumstances that court physicians privately attributed to the physical trauma of bearing children to a man whose bloodline had already begun to show signs of the genetic damage that would eventually destroy the Habsburg line. The wedding ceremony itself was a magnificent display of Habsburg power and wealth, with nobles from across the Holy Roman Empire gathering to witness what was publicly celebrated as a triumph of royal breeding. The cathedral was decorated with tapestries depicting Habsburg victories, the air thick with incense and the sound of chanted prayers. But beneath the pageantry lay a horror that none of the assembled witnesses dared acknowledge. They were watching a child being legally delivered into the hands of a man who would use her body as a tool for producing the next generation of Habsburg heirs. Maria's wedding night was something that medieval chroniclers, even those employed by the Habsburg court, refused to describe in detail. The few accounts that survive speak only in euphemisms about the consummation of royal duty and the sacred obligation of dynasty. But reading between the lines of these sanitized reports and cross-referencing them with medical texts of the period, a horrific picture emerges of a child's body being systematically damaged in service of royal succession. The physical reality of what Maria endured becomes clearer when we examine the medical records that Habsburg court physicians were required to keep. These documents, discovered in the Vienna State Archives in the 19th century but largely suppressed by Habsburg descendants, paint a picture of chronic pain, repeated pregnancy losses, and physical trauma that would mark Maria's short life. She became pregnant for the first time at age 12, her child's body struggling to support a pregnancy that medieval medicine was powerless to assist safely. But the physical trauma was only part of Maria's suffering. The psychological impact of her situation created wounds that no medieval healer could address. Court records describe a child who withdrew into herself, who spoke less and less as the years passed, who developed what we would now recognize as severe depression and anxiety. She lived in constant fear of disappointing her husband, fear of the physical pain that accompanied her royal duties, fear of the courtiers who watched her every move for signs of political weakness. The Habsburg court, for all its magnificence, became Maria's prison. She was surrounded by luxury but denied any meaningful freedom. Every aspect of her daily life was controlled by protocol designed to maximize her utility as a breeding vessel. Her meals were planned by court physicians focused on fertility. Her activities were limited to those deemed appropriate for a pregnant or potentially pregnant royal wife. Her social interactions were restricted to prevent any influence that might interfere with her primary function. Meanwhile, the genetic consequences of Habsburg inbreeding were becoming increasingly apparent with each generation. The distinctive Habsburg jaw, initially considered a mark of noble distinction, was growing more pronounced. Court physicians noted increasing rates of infant mortality, physical deformities, and mental instability among Habsburg children. But rather than recognizing these signs as warnings against continued inbreeding, the family interpreted them as evidence that their bloodline was too pure for the common world, that their suffering was a mark of their divine nature. Maria's story becomes even more tragic when we consider what she might have been in different circumstances. Surviving letters, written in her careful, childish handwriting, reveal glimpses of a bright, curious mind trapped in an impossible situation. She showed interest in the scholarly pursuits that her uncle patronized, asking questions about mathematics and natural philosophy that impressed court tutors. But these intellectual interests were consistently discouraged as inappropriate distractions from her reproductive duties. The pressure on Maria to produce healthy male heirs intensified with each passing year. Every pregnancy was monitored by teams of court physicians, astrologers, and religious advisors. Every miscarriage was analyzed for political implications. Every failed pregnancy was seen as a potential threat to Habsburg succession plans. The young girl who had once shown curiosity about the world around her gradually disappeared, replaced by a hollow-eyed woman whose entire existence revolved around fulfilling biological functions she was too young to understand when they began. The international implications of Maria's marriage extended far beyond the Habsburg territories. Other European royal families were watching this experiment in bloodline purification with intense interest. The success or failure of Habsburg inbreeding policies would influence marriage strategies across the continent for generations to come. In a very real sense, Maria's body had become a testing ground for theories about royal blood and genetic superiority that would shape European politics for centuries. But the most devastating aspect of Maria's story isn't just what happened to her, it's how her suffering was replicated across generations of Habsburg women. Her marriage to Maximilian established precedents that would trap dozens of Habsburg daughters and nieces in similar situations. The family developed an entire legal and religious framework to justify these unions, creating elaborate genealogical charts that demonstrated how inbreeding actually strengthened rather than weakened royal bloodlines. The religious justification for these marriages was particularly cynical. Habsburg court theologians developed interpretations of canon law that portrayed incestuous marriages as spiritually superior to unions with outsiders. They argued that keeping bloodlines pure was a religious duty, that mixing Habsburg blood with foreign royal families was actually a form of spiritual contamination. These theological innovations provided moral cover for practices that caused immense human suffering. Maria's health deteriorated rapidly throughout her teenage years. Medical records describe chronic pain, frequent illness, and what appears to have been severe malnutrition despite access to the finest foods in Europe. Her body, forced into adult functions while still developing, was systematically breaking down under the strain of repeated pregnancies and the stress of court life. Court physicians, following medical theories of the time, often blamed these problems on Maria's supposed moral failings rather than recognizing them as consequences of abuse. The end came when Maria was just 17 years old. Official court records attribute her death to divine will and the burdens of royal responsibility. But examining contemporary medical accounts alongside modern understanding of the health consequences of child marriage and repeated pregnancy trauma, a clearer picture emerges. Maria died from complications that were entirely preventable, the direct result of a system that treated her body as royal property rather than recognizing her basic humanity. But Maria's death didn't end the cycle she had been trapped in. Instead, it reinforced Habsburg commitment to inbreeding policies. Court theologians interpreted her early death as evidence of her spiritual purity, claiming that she had been too divine for earthly existence. Her suffering was reframed as noble sacrifice, her trauma transformed into religious mythology that would justify similar treatment of future Habsburg women. The genetic consequences of these policies would eventually destroy the Habsburg line entirely. By the 18th century, Habsburg rulers were so physically and mentally damaged by centuries of inbreeding that they could no longer function as effective leaders. The final Spanish Habsburg king, Charles II, was so severely deformed and mentally impaired that he was called the Bewitched by his own courtiers. When he died without heirs in 1700, it triggered the War of Spanish Succession and marked the effective end of Habsburg dominance in European politics. The scientific understanding of genetics that would eventually expose the folly of Habsburg breeding policies wouldn't emerge until centuries after Maria's death. But even by medieval standards, there were warning signs that the family chose to ignore. Court physicians documented increasing rates of stillbirth, infant mortality, and physical deformity among Habsburg children. Natural philosophers noted the correlation between family intermarriage and health problems, but these observations were dismissed as attacks on royal legitimacy rather than scientific data worthy of consideration. Maria's story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, tradition, and the willingness of societies to sacrifice individual welfare for institutional stability. The same European civilization that produced magnificent cathedrals, revolutionary art, and groundbreaking philosophy also created legal and religious systems that enabled the systematic abuse of children in service of political ambition. The contrast between public magnificence and private horror was stark and deliberate. The Habsburg marriage policies weren't aberrations or historical accidents. They were the logical extreme of beliefs about bloodline purity and royal legitimacy that were widely shared across medieval and early modern Europe. Maria's suffering was enabled not just by her immediate family, but by an entire continental power structure that viewed royal children as political commodities rather than human beings deserving of protection. Today, we recognize Maria's marriage as what it was, child abuse enabled by political power and religious authority. But it's important to understand that her story wasn't unique. Throughout European history, countless royal daughters were sacrificed to similar policies, their lives reduced to footnotes in the grand narratives of dynastic ambition. Their suffering was hidden behind ceremonial magnificence and theological justification, but it was no less real for being concealed. The Habsburg obsession with bloodline purity ultimately proved self-defeating in the most literal sense possible. Their policies didn't create a superior royal race. They created a genetically damaged lineage that couldn't survive its own contradictions. The very inbreeding that was supposed to concentrate royal virtue instead concentrated genetic defects until the family line collapsed under the weight of its own biological impossibility. Maria of Austria died believing that her suffering served a noble purpose, that her pain was necessary for the greater good of Habsburg rule. She never lived to see how wrong these beliefs would prove to be. The bloodline she sacrificed her childhood and ultimately her life to preserve would end in genetic disaster less than 3 centuries after her death. Her suffering, and that of countless other Habsburg women, served no purpose beyond satisfying the vanity and ambition of men who confused cruelty with strength. The legacy of Maria's story extends far beyond the Habsburg family itself. It serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing traditional authority to override basic human decency, about the consequences of treating people as means rather than ends, about the ultimately self-destructive nature of systems built on exploitation and abuse. The magnificent palaces and churches that the Habsburgs built with their accumulated power still stand today, but the human cost of that power has largely been forgotten. In the end, Maria of Austria represents more than just an individual tragedy. She embodies the countless victims of systems that prioritize institutional power over human welfare. Her story reminds us that behind every grand historical narrative lie individual human lives, and that our responsibility as inheritors of these histories is to remember not just the monuments and achievements, but also the suffering that made them possible. The ring that was placed on Maria's finger when she was 10 years old was eventually melted down and reformed into other Habsburg regalia, its gold recycled into symbols of power for future generations. But the pain it represented, the childhood it marked, the end of, the life it helped destroy, these cannot be so easily transformed or forgotten. They remain as testimony to the human cost of ambition, unchecked by compassion, of tradition untempered by justice, of power unrestrained by basic human decency. If you found this story as haunting as I did, please let me know in the comments below. These forgotten voices from history deserve to be remembered, and their stories need to be told. Like this video if you want to see more hidden histories brought to light, and subscribe for more content exploring the darker corners of our shared past.